police brutality, public education, rally permits. In New York City, every issue is enmeshed in politics. Welcome to the Urban Agenda, a public affairs show that looks at matters that matter to New Yorkers. I'm David R. Jones, show host and president of the Community Service Society of New York, which works to improve the lives of the city's poorest residents. Our guest today is an astute commentator on the city's political scene. He's Fred Siegel, professor of history at Cooper Union and a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. Welcome.
Thank you, David.
One of the things we're seeing at the Community Service Society, the city is going great guns economically, but we're getting a lot of people who are coming in with problems who are very poor, from problems of getting food stamps to being disallowed from any supports. How can we make sure poor people start to participate in this boom economy?
I think one of the problems of this economic boom is it's been too concentrated in Manhattan. There has been a spread out to the outer boroughs in the last year and a half. Nonetheless, it's overwhelmingly concentrated in Manhattan. And I think what we want to do is increase investment, infrastructure investment in the outer boroughs, so that, for instance, the Gowanus is not a permanent traffic jam, so that the South Bronx is not so overwhelmed with fumes. And I think if we increase infrastructure investment in the outer boroughs, we'll be able to move some of the prosperity of Manhattan outward that we haven't been able to do so far.
Well, we at CSS have been working on what we call a jobs initiative, just to try to get people talking about the notion that low-wage jobs, or skilled, what used to be the sort of bread and butter of the city, that we start to take a serious focus. I guess our concern is that if the economy doesn't remain so robust, and all these people start coming off welfare, as they must in the year 2001, that the city may not be prepared to absorb them.
I think you're right. I think the test of welfare reform will come with an economic downturn. I'm somewhat optimistic, though. I think for many people who've gotten off welfare, their understanding of the situation has changed. I think they're more likely now, if they saw a job somewhere else, to take the job somewhere else and not to stay here on welfare. In other words, part of the virtue of welfare reform is it engages people in the larger economy. So if you work in a company that has a branch somewhere else and New York is in trouble, well, maybe you'll move to the place where the job is. On the other hand, I think that the challenge of what happens with the next downturn is do we revert to our bad old habits. The last time we had a downturn, at the end of the 1980s, we took a national downturn and turned it into a local depression. We don't have to do that. We have to be fiscally sound this time. I don't know if you remember, but in the midst of the last recession, we increased spending dramatically. You can't do that without deepening the recession. What I like, and what I'd like to see more of, is taking this prosperity and doing two things with it. One, buying down the debt, which we've done very little of, so that there's more money to spend on what we're talking about, people coming off welfare, and a larger rainy day fund. Again, one of the worst things I've seen in recent years is the attempt by the Congress, particularly Republicans in the Congress, to take the welfare surplus money and say it's ours, we want it back now. That money is going to be needed. That said, I'm mildly optimistic that we will not suffer the same kind of collapse we suffered in the early 90s. But mildly optimistic.
Yeah, what about the jobs, though? Obviously, everyone recognizes that we have a failing public education system, which people may argue whether it should be privatized or not. But at the moment, we have a cohort of kids who are well behind, and I think every measure that's coming out. At the same time, you get everyone from former Labor Secretary Bob Reich to Paul Kennedy at MIT talking about the fact that basically unskilled people, particularly people without high school, and even to a certain extent people with a couple of years of college, are going to be a drug on the market. And we got a lot.
Oh, no, we're amply supplied. I think you have to take a look at immigration policy here. Immigration, I think, in general is a very good thing. Eating is a very good thing, but I only do it 3 times a day. And I think at this point, what's happening is what continuous immigration does is drive down low-end wages. You can't have a continuous flow of people competing for the same niche of unskilled jobs. And I think unless we deal with immigration policy to some extent, it's going to be very hard to create jobs faster than newly poor people are arriving in the United States.
It's interesting. CSS did a small monograph looking at the issue of the garment industry, and I think the knee-jerk reaction by many of us was to think that that would be an incredible opportunity. It doesn't work out, apparently, however, because garment industry, perhaps not indicative of all industries where immigrants end up, are basically paying, in some measures, below minimum wage. But you find that when you look at the family structure, that you have two people earning below the minimum wage, putting together a family income that lifts them somewhat higher. And the notion that we had that these would be automatic jobs that people coming off welfare could get, turned out when you started talking one-on-one with people in this industry was, in fact, those jobs would go offshore, that we'd lose them entirely, that they would not lead to an immediate absorption of our low-wage worker.
I think there's some truth to that, but that said, if you continue to put pressure on the low-end market, if you continually importing unskilled people, and if you have people coming off welfare competing for those same jobs, supply and demand tells you that you're going to be able to continuously pay very low wages. Garment industry is special. Garment industry is one of the most highly competitive industries in the world. What we're not seeing, and what we should have seen some benefit, we should have seen more of an increase in the low end of the restaurant workers, for instance. The waiters now, are doing extremely well, but people in the kitchen are not making out in this economy, and I think that's a function of an oversupply of labor. Garment industry is a very tough one. It is the most competitive industry in the United States. And internationally, so maybe nothing will help there.
How would you go about changing immigration policy in a way that it doesn't end up discriminatory? Which, this is a long history of who gets selected to be excluded here.
It's a very sensitive issue. I'd go in the Canadian direction, and that is, I would base entry increasingly on skills and not family reunification, because what family reunification policy does, it creates a chain of poverty, poor families bringing in their relatives. I would base it on skills. And skills alone. If people have skills, good. What I think more important than a change in the policy is really a breather. Is just a breather in immigration policy altogether. What I worry is going to happen with the next downturn, and both here in California, is that anti-immigration sentiment is going to become fairly serious. And you see it, anti-immigration sentiment, by the way, among recent immigrants, because they have
as soon as they get it.
Yeah, as soon as they have a foothold, because they have a sense that their place on the ladder is being eroded. It's not cultural. It's self-interest. Right. I'm working now for $8 an hour. Some guy's arriving, and he and his brother-in-law are willing together to work for $5. Well, I can't compete with that.
The fear, of course, in the Latino community and the Caribbean community, which I know about, is that this is going to be essentially a cover for knocking out their economic opportunity, while more attractive immigrants do really well. And I guess the family reunification obviously goes directly at that. I mean, we have a whole neighborhood in central Brooklyn which has been basically doing fairly well against the rest of the economy in terms of moving. They haven't created a culture of poverty, as a matter of fact. They've had an enormous amount of entrepreneurship, and they've seen incredible wealth generation going back almost 100 years. And I guess their fears, and the fears, I think, of the Latino community, that this is going to be an effort to, as they tried in California and reacted very vigorously to politically, as another attack on their rights and their families.
But I think it's going to seem more problematic, even for people who have these fears, if the economy turns down. In California, what's interesting is in Los Angeles, which has experienced even heavier immigration than we have, you have downward mobility in the midst of this economic boom for recent immigrants. Mm-hmm. Each new wave of immigrants arriving in California and New York is poorer than the previous wave. We have here in New York a population, the Dominican population, which is substantially worse off now than it was 10 years ago. That suggests to me that people are going to look at this in a complex way. They're going to understand that, yes, there are family concerns, but also people have basic economic concerns. If there's this declining mobility, and if people are increasingly poorer with each new wave of immigration, maybe we better think about what immigration
Well,
means.
this gets to the broader issue of why people are being driven out of their local economies. I don't want to turn the whole show into a more broad issue, but when I used to work for Mayor Koch, this was obviously one of the central concerns. We're drawing immigrant populations from a whole region, which is having economic problems, and partly engendered by the United States. The whole CARICOM notion of trying to sustain an economic engine in that whole area was not to help people there, but to start to create a real economy that people had options. I don't think you're going to be able to stop people. If my grandparents are any indicator, they'll come no matter what.
If you're right, David, and perhaps you are, then we're going to expect to see a continued outmigration when the economy turns up or downward of skilled people who will not want to be in a situation where they're burdened with an enormous poverty population.
Well,
and I don't think that's very healthy for the city in the long term.
The trouble is we could be in 1910 and having this discussion and the same argument for the Jews and the white immigrants of another time.
But I think we couldn't for one reason. Part of the difference between now and then is the relative demand for unskilled labor. What's happened in the 1990s is something unprecedented in human history. The creation of the first mass upper middle class society. Nothing like this has ever existed before. And so the income distribution looks very different than it once did. It's no longer the old pyramid.
Right.
It's more like an hourglass now.
Yep.
And what people want to do when they get near the middle of the hourglass is jump to the other side and free themselves of the cost of poverty population. So in that sense, it's not like 19. Obviously, there are ways that it is like 1910, and there are ways that it isn't. Mm-hmm. This digital economy that we're creating is producing an enormous number of high-end jobs. But I like to joke it's producing low-end jobs, $200 meal at a time. That does not provide, say, a viable future for, say, Dominican immigrants who come here and who are hardworking and would be very good, say, in factory work. But we as a city have not invested in the kind of infrastructure required for even light manufacturing in a half a century.
Well, getting to that issue, shifting off the immigration, could we come up with incentives actually to provide some expansion in the low-wage economy?
Well, I think
or would it be worth it? Would it be cost-effective?
I don't think incentives will do a very good job because we can't compete with other places that will offer incentives, counter incentives. What we can do is make ourselves more attractive. A cross-harbor tunnel, so that goods can be shipped more cheaply and easily out of, would be of great aid to all of Long Island, not just Brooklyn, but all of Long Island would benefit from this. In fact, New York east of the Hudson would benefit from this. Lower electricity costs, lower basic cost or what's required. People forget New York was a low-cost manufacturing city in 1910. We've got to make ourselves more competitive. Special incentives tend to produce counter incentives, which tend to produce counter incentives, and we probably won't end up a winner. I mean, Wall Street was just given $960 million to rebuild the exchange, and now the exchange is going digital, and this money will just be pocketed.
Well, what about that? Have the administrations, not only this administration, but prior, given away too much of the store for businesses that really don't produce much in the end?
Well, Wall Street is our lifeblood, but nonetheless, I think administrations are in a difficult position. No one wants to be blamed for losing major companies, so everyone panics and says, we must pony up, when in many cases they're just being shaken down. It's the uncertainty of whether we're being shaken down. That's why I think it's important to lower costs overall, and then you can say to a company, look, we're fairly competitive. You don't need this extra money, or you're going to flee to Jersey City. Mayor Brett Schindler of Jersey City, who's a very sharp guy, once said, what do you offer in the way of incentives? He said, well, I offer a lower sales tax, a lower income tax, and on and on and on, lower land costs. I don't have to offer incentives. I am an incentive. We have to face up to the fact that even our core industries are essentially footloose. If we ask where are the leading banking centers in the United States today, we would have to include Charlotte. 30 years ago, no one thought of Charlotte as being much of anything. It's a leading bank. Austin has become a banking center. San Jose is a center of venture capital. Wall Street is dispersing all across the country on the web, but also into these new fast-growing areas.
So let's talk to the new mayor. I have too much baggage with the current mayor.
We have a new mayor.
Yeah, we have a new mayor, let's suppose, and we must. What would be the advice? They're coming into perhaps not a down economy yet, but clearly a softening of the economy. They've got, I don't know, 200,000, 300,000 people coming off welfare. What do you suggest to them as they start to deal with this? They can't affect immigration policy directly, and that's going to be a fight. Right. Probably I'll be on the other side of much of it. But what do we suggest to make this better for everybody?
Well, let's assume an optimistic scenario that we see the downturn coming, but it hasn't come yet.
Right.
I think it's important in these budgets to pay, as I said earlier, pay down the debt, increase the rainy day fund, so that when the hard times come, the city doesn't increase spending and doesn't drive business out as it has in the past. If it does that, it then will be in a position to use supplemental funds to help people make it through hard times. There's no question in my mind that if we hit hard times again, people are not going to be cut off welfare. We have to sustain. We have to sustain people. We'll do it on an ad hoc basis. We won't say we're breaking the rules. We'll say we'll bend them slightly. But that said, you know, the rest of the country did not experience the kind of downturn we experienced. No. If we don't experience such a sharp downturn, this won't be so much of a problem. The other thing is, I'm not sure you're right about the number of people coming off welfare. I suspect the numbers are going to be considerably lower than that. The reason I think that is, if the numbers that are coming off now continue at the sustained rate, numbers at the other end aren't going to be as high.
Well, I think that's where this administration and I part company. The failure of this administration to allow any access to real data and to understand what's happening makes this, you know, this looks like a return to the old Soviet Union here. They're saying crop production has increased. I have no idea, nor does anyone else have any idea. And that's why, you know, they may be right, but they've become so secretive about it that they've diminished the efficacy of what they're trying.
I agree. I think it's an enormous mistake not to be more open. A mistake on their own terms. In other words, if this is a success, I think in fact it is a tremendous success. Let's get it out there. Let's have the statistics so that we know when a downturn comes. How do we move? How do we move? What was effective? What wasn't effective? And you can't do it with such a small study as they did last time. But what's interesting, David, is if you look around the country at other places that have done more extensive studies, it is promising.
As a matter of fact, you know, I think we, along with a number of not-for-profits, have already moved on. We're talking about how do you sustain people effectively. There are going to be benefits available to people once they get off welfare, and you should encourage, actually, them to have those benefits in order to make sure the work experience is sustainable. And that's where we really part company. Not that the fact that work is obviously the only way to go in this economy. And I think this is more pervasive than just New York. This is where the country is going. And to try to play games and saying, oh, we should return to anything isn't a form of insanity. But then you should go about, what could we do to actually make this something that's not only a positive experience for the individual, but is sustainable?
I agree. I think that one missed opportunity has been with workfare. You have, my wife, Jan Rosenberg, has written about this. You have nonprofits with real job requirements that would be a wonderful transition opportunity, I think, for people coming off welfare. We haven't done enough with workfare. The first phase was good, move people off welfare, but we didn't. The back end has been weak. Also, we haven't done enough in the city, I think, to get people onto the earned income tax credit, which is difficult. It's complex.
Well, that's what bureaucrats are great at. I mean, this is perfect for bureaucrats. I've run bureaucratic agencies. They love this kind of stuff.
I think that's been a problem. I think that's correctable. On an earlier question you raised, there's a tension in the law between getting people off welfare and getting people benefits that they're entitled to. So everywhere in the country, not just in New York, food stamp rolls are dropping. Are they dropping too much? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Again, the data is very shaky. But there's a tension that's not resolved. What I worry about in the next mayor is that we're going to regress, that we won't just help people temporarily through the downturn, but some of the old welfare system will willy-nilly return.
I sort of doubt it. As a matter of fact, one of our fears is that someone is going to try to be a gentler and kinder Giuliani administration and not deal with some of the things that could be fixed. I think the food stamp issue obviously is something that they haven't been instructing their employees to really try to make sure somebody who's entitled to food stamps actually get it. Shouldn't mess with that. And the same in health care. This is something they really should leave alone. But I think they've created an ideological momentum here that doesn't allow them to instruct their employees actually to be helpful, to try to say, look, Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Smith, we know this is tough, but here's what it is. We're going to do everything in our power to make this happen for you. And in losing that, I think they lose a lot of opportunity here to make this a permanent change.
But to be fair to the city, everyone in the country is having this problem. The law is contradictory. The food stamp law and the welfare reform bill are, Congress didn't bother to resolve the differences between them. The welfare law was put together too hastily, I think, in a whole variety of ways, including on the area of immigration, where I didn't agree with what was done. But I think optimistically, there's been a change in assumptions. By making work normative again, it's allowed people to stand on their own legs, to look out and see a wider horizon. The worst thing about welfare, as far as I was concerned, is the way that it trapped people in a narrow horizon where they couldn't see what was going on around them. And I would see this sometimes talking to classes when I go to a high school. This is the mid-'90s when there's a boom in the rest of the country. We hadn't fully come out of the recession. People had no idea that good things were happening in other places. There was this very narrow sense of what was possible.
And I think if this were a race-neutral country, that would work. People would pick up and move. The trouble, I think, that adds a problem for New York, California, and other places is the issue of race and the inability. All things being equal, if the country was wide open, like your oyster, basically, I think people would get up and move. I think this has been unique because race has, to a large extent, limited options, but some of it is internally driven. I remember growing up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where I came out of a college-educated family. We lived in a block of all our neighbors, but I remember coming back from college and meeting children and youngsters and young adults who hadn't left the 10-square block area. Didn't know about going into the city meant going into Manhattan, and were sort of clustered and cloistered, and that's extraordinarily dangerous. That's why I was so concerned that they not only did they defund some of the programs that were perhaps frills, but they defunded all the youth programs in the city of New York, which were necessary to make that transition. But once having said that, I think unless we come to grips with the issue of not only welfare reform, but also the issue of poverty and race and welfare reform, we're going to have real difficulties making this transition. The mayor's sort of off-the-cuff notion, we'll give them bus tickets out, when he was early on in his administration, just doesn't work in New York.
Dave, let me make a point about how the question of welfare and the poor affects what will be the great issue of the coming years, and it is already a major issue, the sprawl question. Most New Yorkers aren't aware of it, but much of the country, the issue is too much growth. Mm-hmm. You have the extraordinary situation in Oregon where if Intel creates too many jobs, they have to pay a penalty, $1,000 a job. Or the fight in Northern Virginia, this complaint that AOL and MCI are creating too many jobs, changing the countryside too quickly, and they want to slow it down. Part of what makes it difficult for people to leave the inner city and move and be fully mobile are zoning laws. Zoning laws which say, in our town, plots must be 2.5 acres each. What the sprawl movement is going to do, it's going to make it harder for minorities to be upwardly mobile. Because one of the good things about sprawl, and sprawl has its bad side, I don't want to argue that. One of the good things about sprawl is it's helped increase minority home ownership, which is now at record levels. Because what happens with sprawl is people in the city are able to buy relatively affordable houses on the periphery. One of the responses to sprawl, which is in many ways a legitimate one, is to preserve open space. That's a good thing. But when you preserve open space, you don't end sprawl. It just leapfrogs, so it goes out even further out. And in a sense, the fast-growing areas of the digital economy are even further away from. Let me bring up one aspect of the digital economy, which I hope will affect New York and provide a kind of uplift for updraft for the whole New York economy. There is a proposal afoot to turn Governor's Island not into a gambling casino, not into an entertainment palace, but into a conference center and a high-tech center. And one of the great stories of recent years is that the software industry is real now. A few years ago, I just thought it was a trust fund joke. Kids with trust funds spending their dad's money until it went. But now we have a whole number of IPOs, venture capital is coming in, and it's really taking off. For most of the new digital economy, the cities are not an attractive place. Engineers like to live in what my friend Joel Kotkin calls nerdistans, neatly groomed, exurban locations. But the software people, they tend to be a little funkier. They want to be in the city. They want to be in a place like Silicon Alley. And they are the first new sector of the economy in a half century. We have to nurture them. And I hope this Governor's Island project is one way to do it. Because if they succeed, they will create the kind of updraft which says, well, look, we have a small business sector succeeding now. Maybe we ought to think about this for all of New York. It doesn't have to just be Silicon Alley. And there's not enough space in Manhattan for all these people. Wouldn't it be interesting if we got some of Silicon Alley along the Brooklyn waterfront?
Beautiful. You're starting to see little signs of it even now. When you drive along near the Navy Yard.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes.
Little boutiques and stuff beginning to emerge.
Yes, I think that's right. That's very promising.
Will, however, fundamentally, the children of the very poor really be able to participate in this? I've been, the notion of access to hardware. Obviously, in our latest studies of inner city schools, you find no science labs. Sure, they have computers, they're all in closets, no one knows how to use it. Their math instructors never even took first-year math in college. They're being used to teach pre-calc. They don't know it themselves. Can they really participate in all this new wealth?
Well, two things here. One way, I think they will have access to the web. I think web TV is going to broaden access enormously. But what you're talking about doesn't only affect the poorest kids. What's interesting is middle-class kids in New York don't get a science education.
I know.
Science education collapsed sometime in the 1970s. It got dropped from the curriculum, not in a literal sense, but in a functional sense. It was, and I think it's an enormous disadvantage for us. If you look at where the shortages of jobs are, if I'm a lower middle class kid now and I want to make it, the place I can make it is a technician, a lab technician,
right.
a computer. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says that there are 1.5 million unfilled jobs sitting in the country right now for these kind of technical skills. This is where to go. Our school system is so mired in so many other efforts, God knows what. I see recently now that the success of Rudy Crew in Tacoma is now come under question from a Department of Education study. Science education may require that we rethink how we hire teachers. It would be wonderful. My father is an engineer, helped design Rubik's Cube. When he retired, he wanted to teach in a high school, an inner city high school, teach math and physics. Yeah. He wasn't allowed to do that. You need to bring people like that into the schools who have real skills.
It's interesting. Of all the things I most regret with the mayor, it's not some of his policies, but he had the opportunity, perhaps unique among mayors in our certainly my memory, to break through and become a bully pulpit on the issue of better education, and we never got it. And I hope the next mayor and whoever else comes starts to get this. But I think you're absolutely correct. The failure of science, where the science my father was getting in the 1920s, was of better quality at boys, and in the high schools, an all-black high school, better than it is now, is obscene. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
For every improvement the mayor and the city government has made, there has been a cost. The drop in crime has led to a perception of increased harassment among some in minority neighborhoods. The cut in welfare rolls has resulted in many people being denied unrelated benefits like Medicaid and food stamps. Corporate tax breaks have been accompanied by huge cuts in public spending for libraries and parks and low-cost housing. To succeed as a city, New York must strike some kind of balance between its economic and human needs. That has yet to happen yet, but it's certain to be a focus of the upcoming senatorial and mayoral races. This is David R. Jones. Thank you for joining us on the Urban Agenda.